They say the invisible see everything. That was Sophie's superpower. She was a ghost in a black apron, refilling water glasses and wiping crumbs from white tablecloths while the city's most dangerous men discussed murder over risotto. But that night, silence wasn't an option. One hand trembling beneath a silver serving tray, one crumpled receipt with 7 words scrolled in panicked ink. Your wife set a trap. Leave now. That tiny slip of paper didn't just save a crime boss's life. It started a war that would burn the city to the ground. And Sophie, she was standing right in the center of the flames. The air inside Restaurant Bully always smelled of truffle oil, expensive cologne, and fear. It was the kind of establishment where a bottle of wine cost more than Sophie's rent for 3 months, and the clean ale arrived in armored SUVs with tinted windows. Sophie adjusted the collar of her uniform, checking her reflection in the polished brass of the espresso machine. She looked tired. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it hurt, highlighting the pale exhaustion on her face. She preferred it that way. Being attractive in a place like Betrayal's was a liability. Being invisible was survival. Table 4 needs a decanter for the 96 Barola. Move it. Sophie the Matrai, a sweating man named Marco, snapped his fingers near her face. Sophie nodded, keeping her eyes on the floor. Yes, Marco. She moved through the dining room with practiced fluidity. She knew the rhythm of the place. She knew that the man at table 7 was cheating on his wife, and that the politician at table 9 was taking bribes in envelopes tucked into the dessert menu. She saw it all and she said nothing. Her silence was the currency that allowed her to keep this job, which paid just enough to keep the debt collectors away from her mother's nursing home bills. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a drop in pressure. The heavy oak doors swung open and the ambient chatter died down to a hushed whisper. Edward Valente walked in. Even Sophie, who made a point of never staring, couldn't help but look. Edward was the head of the Valente crime family, the undisputed king of the eastern seaboard. He was tall, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders like armor. His face was hard carved from granite with dark eyes that scanned the room with the predatory focus of a wolf. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed his power. He looked like a man burdened by it. On his arm was his wife, Victoria. If Edward was the granite, Victoria was the diamond that cut it. She was breathtakingly beautiful, wearing a dress of crimson silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her dark hair cascaded over one shoulder, and her lips were painted a blood red that matched her dress. But while Edward's eyes were alert, Victoria's were cold, dead. They're sitting in the alcove, Marco hissed, grabbing Sophie's arm. You're on them tonight. Do not mess this up. Mr. Valente is particular. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. The alcove was the most private table tucked away behind a velvet curtain near the kitchen service corridor. It offered privacy, but it also meant Sophie would be the only barrier between them and the rest of the world. She approached the table with water, her hands shaking slightly. Edward was staring at his phone, his jaw tight. Victoria was looking at her reflection in a butter knife, checking her lipstick, sparkling. Edward said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look up. Of course, Sophie whispered. She poured the water, careful not to spill a drop. As she retreated, she felt Victoria's eyes on her. It wasn't a look of jealousy. It was a look of assessment, like a butcher eyeing a piece of meat. 20 minutes later, Sophie was in the service corridor restocking the napkin supply. The corridor shared a thin decorative wall with the alcove. The ventilation grate was loose, a quirk of the old building that the owners had never fixed. Through the great voices carried with crystal clarity. You're paranoid. Dom Victoria's voice floated through smooth and dismissive. It's not paranoia when the shipments are getting hit 3 times a week. Victoria. Edward sounded exhausted. Someone on the inside is talking and I'm going to find them. Let's just enjoy dinner, she soothed. It's our anniversary. Relax. I ordered that vintage scotch you like. It's coming from the reserve cellar. There was the sound of a chair scraping. I need to use the restroom, Edward said. His heavy footsteps faded away. Sophie froze. She should leave. She should go back to the kitchen. But then she heard the rapid tapping of a phone screen and Victoria's voice completely changed. The loving wife tone was gone. replaced by urgent, venomous steel. He's distracted, no.
Listen to me, Adrian. Do it tonight. Yes, when we leave. The valet has the car. Rig it now.
I'll make sure he waits by the curb for me to fix my coat. Just make sure the blast is big enough to leave nothing behind. I want the closed casket. Sophie's blood turned to ice. Adrian, that was Edward's underboss, his right hand. And his wife was orchestrating his execution. I love you too, Victoria whispered, a cruel smirk audible in her voice. Tonight I become the widow Valente and we take everything. Sophie stood paralyzed in the hallway, a stack of linen napkins clutched to her chest. She had heard too much. If she walked away, a man would die in less than an hour. If she spoke up, she would be killed. The kitchen doors swung open, and the sous chef yelled for a runner. Sophie jolted. She had to go back out there. She had to serve the woman who had just ordered her husband's murder. The dining room felt like a minefield now. Every clink of silverware sounded like the cocking of a gun. Sophie moved toward the alcove, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared they could see it through her uniform. Edward had returned. He was sitting back looking at the ceiling, one hand resting on the table. He looked lonely. That was the strangest part. The most powerful man in the city looked profoundly lonely. Victoria was smiling at him, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Happy anniversary, my love, Victoria purred. To us, Edward replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Sophie approached with the appetizers, beef carpaccio with truffle shavings. Her hands were trembling violently. She set the plates down. Clear his throat, girl, Victoria snapped. You're shaking the table, clumsy. I'm sorry, Mom, Sophie stammered. Low blood sugar. I apologize. Edward looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes weren't angry. They were observant. He saw the terror in her pupils. He likely assumed she was just intimidated by his reputation. He didn't know she was terrified for him. Take a breath, Edward said quietly. Nobody's going to bite you. The irony made Sophie want to scream. The woman next to you is about to blow you into pieces. She retreated to the service station. Her mind was racing. She couldn't speak. Victoria would deny it, and Adrian would have Sophie killed before she left the block. She couldn't call the police. The Valente owned half the precinct. She looked at her order pad. The white paper stared back at her. She grabbed a pen. Her hand clear, his throat shook so bad. The letters came out jagged and harsh. Your wife set a trap. Leave now. She stared at it. It was insane. It was a death sentence. But she remembered the look in Edward's eyes, the exhaustion. He was a criminal, yes, but did he deserve to be blown up by the woman he slept next to? She tore the slip off. She folded it once, then twice, until it was a tiny square. She needed a reason to go back. The scotch. Victoria had ordered the reserve scotch. Sophie went to the bar. The Glenfiddich 30 for table 4, she told the bartender. He handed her the heavy crystal glass. She placed a tiny square of paper under the coaster. This was it. She walked back to the table. The conversation had died down. Victoria was texting under the table. Edward was staring into the middle distance. Your scotch, sir, Sophie said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. She placed the coaster down. She placed the glass on top of it, but she did it clumsily, intentionally, catching the edge of the paper with her thumb so it slid out slightly, resting against the base of the glass, the ink visible. Edward reached for the drink. He paused. He saw the purr. Sophie held her breath. Victoria was busy looking at her phone, smiling at whatever text Adrian had sent confirming the bomb was set. Edward's fingers brushed the paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at Sophie. She gave a microscopic nod, her eyes wide, pleading, read it. Edward's expression didn't change. He was a master of the poker face. He smoothly palmed the note as he lifted the glass, bringing the paper into his lap in one fluid motion. He took a sip of the scotch, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Under the table, he unfolded the paper. Sophie watched his pupils contract. The muscle in his jaw jumped once. That was the only sign that his world had just shattered. He looked at Victoria, the woman he had married 3 years ago, the woman who was currently texting her lover about his death. Edward set the glass down. He didn't finish it. Victoria, he said. His voice was different, darker. Yes, darling. She looked up, beaming. I forgot my phone in the car. He lied. He tapped his jacket pocket. I need to grab it. I'm expecting a call from the Chicago associate. Send the driver, Victoria said quickly. Or the girl. She pointed a manicured nail at Sophie. No. Edward stood up. It's sensitive. I'll be right back. Order dessert. Victoria hesitated. If he went to the car now before they paid the bill, the timing would be off, but she couldn't stop him without raising suspicion. Hurry back. I have a surprise for you. I bet you do, Edward muttered. He turned. He walked past Sophie. As he passed her, his hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with a force that bruised. Walk with me, he commanded, loud enough for the room to hear. You messed up the order. I want to show you exactly what I want. Dom, don't cause a scene, Victoria called out, annoyed. Just correcting the service, Victoria. Edward called back. He didn't look at her. He dragged Sophie toward the kitchen doors. The moment the double doors swung shut behind them, the facade dropped. The exhausted man was gone. The killer was awake. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of shouting chefs and sizzling pans, but Edward cut through it like a shark. He didn't let go of Sophie's arm. He marched her past the confused line cooks, past the dish pit, straight to the back delivery exit. Is it true? He demanded, slamming his hand against the metal crash bar of the door, but not opening it yet. He pinned Sophie with a glare that could peel paint. If you're lying to me, if this is some game, she's on the phone with Adrian. Sophie gasped, tears finally spilling over. She told him to rig the car. She said she wants to be a widow tonight. She said she wants a closed casket. The name Adrian was the key. Sophie couldn't have known about Adrian unless she heard it. Edward's face went gray. A profound, terrible hurt flashed across his eyes, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating rage. He pulled a Sigurpune 65 from a holster beneath his jacket. He checked the chamber. We can't go out the front, Sophie whispered. The valet, the car is out front. I know, Edward growled. We go out the back. My personal driver, Luca, is in the alley with the backup SUV. He's the only one I trust besides. Well, I used to trust Adrian. He kicked the back door open. The night air was freezing. A black Cadillac Escalade was idling in the alleyway. Edward dragged Sophie toward it. Wait. Sophie struggled. I can't go with you. I have to go back to work. If I leave, if you go back in there, Victoria will torture you until you tell her what you told me, Edward said, opening the rear door and shoving her inside. You're a loose end now, Sophie. You're in this. He jumped in beside her. Luca, go now. The driver, a massive man with a shaved head and a scar running down his neck, didn't ask questions. He slammed the accelerator. The SUV screeched down the alleyway, tires smoking. They were 2 blocks away when it happened. A dull thump vibrated through the chassis of the SUV, followed seconds later by a roar that shook the windows. Edward twisted in his seat to look back. A plume of black smoke and orange fire was rising into the night sky, originating from the front of Ristorante Barole. Sophie covered her mouth, sobbing. The valet, the doorman. Collateral damage, Edward said, though his voice was thick with suppressed emotion. He watched the fire rise. That was his car. That was where he was supposed to be sitting. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a text from Victoria. Where are you, honey? The dessert is here. She didn't know the bomb had gone off yet. No, the sound travel was delayed. Or maybe she was playing the part until the police arrived. She thinks I'm dead, Edward whispered. Or she thinks I'm about to be. He looked at Sophie. She was huddled in the corner of the leather seat, hugging her knees, shivering in her thin waitress uniform. She looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place next to the gun resting on the seat and the crime boss staring at a burning building. What's your name? Edward asked. Sophie, she whispered. Soap. Hi, Miller. Well, Sophie Miller, Edward said, reaching into the mini-fridge console and pulling out a bottle of water. He cracked the seal and handed it to her. You just saved the life of the head of the Valente family, and in doing so, you just became the #1 target of the new Valente administration, my wife. Sophie stared at the water. Where are we going? Edward looked out the window at the passing city lights. His face was a mask of war. We're going to the one place Adrian and Victoria won't look. The old slaughterhouse district. I have a safe house there that hasn't been on the books since my father's time. He turned back to her, his eyes intense. You're not a waitress anymore, Sophie. Tonight, you're the most valuable asset I have because you're the witness. The SUV merged onto the highway, disappearing into the stream of traffic, leaving the sirens and the flames far behind. But Sophie knew with a sinking dread in her stomach that the fire wasn't behind them. Clear as throat, they were bringing it with them. The meatpacking district was a graveyard of industry, a sprawling labyrinth of brick and rusted iron, where the city's lights didn't reach. The Cadillac Escalade navigated the potholes with a jarring rhythm, the silence inside the cabin heavier than the darkness outside. Edward hadn't spoken a word since the highway. He was busy stripping the SIM card from his phone and crushing it between his thumb and forefinger. "Pull in here," Edward commanded. Luca swerved the massive vehicle into what looked like a collapsed loading bay. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating a steel roll-up door covered in decades of graffiti. Luca pressed a remote clipped to the visor, and the door groaned upward, revealing a cavernous, empty warehouse that smelled of stale blood and sawdust. As the car parked and the engine died, the silence rushed back in, ringing in Sophie's ears. She felt like she was floating, detached from reality. An hour ago, she was serving Pa Grigio. Now she was in a fugitive's hideout. "Out," Edward said, opening his door. The warehouse was freezing. Sophie hugged her arms, her teeth chattering. Edward noticed. Without a word, he took off his suit jacket, the bespoke charcoal wool still smelling of the restaurant, and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of expensive tobacco and gunpowder. Upstairs, he gestured to a rusted iron staircase. The office. The office was a single room overlooking the warehouse floor. It had blacked-out windows, a dusty desk, and a wall of monitors that were currently dark. Edward walked to a breaker box and flipped a switch. The room hummed to life. He turned to Sophie. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him looking dangerous and cornered. "Strip," he said. Sophie froze, clutching the jacket tighter. "What I need to know, you're not wearing a wire," Edward said, his voice devoid of sexual intent. It was purely clinical. "Victoria is smart. Adrian is smarter. If they planted you to lead me here, I need to know before I plan my next move." "I'm not a plant," Sophie cried, her voice echoing in the small room. "I'm a waitress. I make $12 an hour plus tips. I saved your life." Why, Edward took a step closer, invading her space. He was terrifyingly large up close. "Why did you do it? You saw a mob boss. You heard a hit was ordered. Most people would run. Most Plo would pretend they heard nothing. You slipped a note. You risked your life. Why?" Sophie looked up at him, trembling, but holding his gaze. "Because my mother is in the St. Jude nursing home in Queens. She has dementia. If I lose my job, she gets evicted. I can't afford to get involved in a police investigation. I can't afford to be a witness in court." But she paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "But I couldn't let you clear his throat die. You looked like my dad used to look before he passed. Tired. Just tired." Edward stared at her for a long time, the intensity in his eyes softened just a fraction. He saw the truth in her fear. "Keep your clothes on," he muttered, turning away. "I believe you." He walked to the desk and pulled a hidden drawer open, revealing a dusty bottle of bourbon and 2 Glocks. He checked the magazines with practiced ease. Luca Edward called out to the driver who was standing guard at the door. "Go to the safe in the floor, get the cash. We need to buy new phones, burner laptops, and a car that isn't registered to the family." "Boss," Luca said, his voice grave. "We have a problem. The floor safe. It's been welded shut recently." Edward froze. He walked to the window, looking down at the warehouse floor. Adrian knew about this place. Edward realized his voice a low growl. "He didn't think I'd survive the blast, but he locked down my contingencies just in case. They're squeezing me out, freezing the accounts, locking the safe houses." He turned back to Sophie. The situation was worse than he thought. He had no money, no army, and the whole city thought he was dead. "Sophie," Edward said, sitting on the edge of the desk, "do you have a car?" "A 2014 Hours. Honda Civic," she whispered. It's parked 3 blocks from the restaurant. It's probably swarming with cops by now. Edward rubbed his temples. We are ghosts, Sophie. But ghosts need to eat, and ghosts need to fight back. He looked at the monitors. He booted up a laptop connecting to the public Wi-Fi from the coffee shop down the street using a directional antenna. He pulled up the local news, the screen filled with the image of the burning rester. The headline screamed, "Mob boss Edward Valente feared dead in explosion." And there on the screen was Victoria. She was standing outside the police cordon wrapped in a blanket, sobbing into a handkerchief. She looked devastated. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. Beside her stood Adrian, his hand on her shoulder looking stoic and protective. "Look at them," Edward whispered, hatred radiating off him like heat. "Celebrating." "What are we going to do?" Sophie asked. Edward looked at her. "You're going to help me steal back my kingdom. Clear as throat, but first we need to get you out of that uniform." The next morning, the city of New York woke up to a power vacuum. The newspapers were already speculating on a gang war, but Adrian moved fast. By noon, he had called a meeting of the Carpos, the captains of the Valente crime family. Edward sat in the warehouse, watching the feed from a hidden camera he had installed in his own boardroom years ago, a camera Adrian evidently didn't know about. On the grainy black and white monitor, Sophie watched as Adrian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, Edward's chair. Victoria sat to his right, wearing black morning clothes, her face dry and hard. "Edward is gone," Adrian told the assembled men. "It was the Brada, the Russians. They hit us on our anniversary. A lie, a convenient lie to rally the troops for a war that would distract them while Adrian consolidated power. We need to strike back one of the Carpos." A man named Polly slammed his fist on the table. "For Dom, we will." Victoria spoke up, her voice steady. "But first, we must secure the business. Adrian will take temporary command." Edward laughed at Bry's humorless sound. "Temporary, right?" He turned to Sophie. She was wearing an oversized mechanic's jumpsuit they had found in a locker. She looked ridiculous, but she was listening intently. "They're going to move the ledger," Edward said. "The black ledger. It contains the names of every judge, politician, and cop on our payroll. It's the source of true power. Without it, Adrian is just a thug. With it, he's untouchable." "Where is it?" Sophie asked. "It's in a safety deposit box at the Majestic Union Trust Bank in Midtown," Edward explained. "But it requires 2 keys. I have one," he tapped his chest. "Victoria has the other." "So we can't get it," Sophie said. "No." Edward smiled, a wolfish grin returning. "Victoria is greedy. She won't leave that book in the bank. She doesn't trust Adrian fully. She'll want it close to her. She's going to move it today, before the funeral." He pointed to the screen. Victoria was checking her watch. "She's going to the bank," Edward said, "and we are going to be there to meet her." Sophie squeaked. "Edward, look at me. I'm a waitress. I drop forks when I'm nervous." Edward walked over to her. He placed his hands on her shoulders. For the first time, his touch was gentle. "Sophie, you are the only person in this city O isn't trying to kill me. You are invisible. You said it yourself. People don't look at the help. We're going to use that." He outlined the plan. It was insane. Clear as throat, it was dangerous, and it was their only shot. They took the subway. Edward wore a baseball cap pulled low, and a thick worker's jacket hiding his face. Sophie wore a stolen coat. They looked like any other couple struggling through the rush hour grind. They staked out the Union Trust Bank from a cafe across the street. At 2:00 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled up. Victoria stepped out, flanked by 2 bodyguards. She looked regal in her grief. "She's going in," Edward said, into a burner phone he was using to communicate with Luca, who was parked in a stolen van around the corner. 10 minutes later, Victoria emerged. She was clutching a thick leather briefcase. "She has it," Edward said. "Luca, get ready." Victoria didn't get back in the car. She began walking down the busy avenue, likely heading to her lawyer's office 2 blocks away. The traffic was gridlocked. Walking was faster. Her bodyguards formed a wedge around her. Now Edward nudged Sophie. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the performance of her life. She ran out of the cafe holding a large cup of iced coffee. She sprinted across the street, weaving through pedestrians, aiming straight for Victoria. Just as she reached the group, Sophie tripped. She launched herself forward, the iced coffee flying out of her hand and drenching Victoria's pristine black silk coat. "Oh my God!" Sophie screamed, crashing into Victoria. "I'm so sorry. I'm so clumsy." Chaos erupted. The bodyguards grabbed Sophie, throwing her back roughly. Victoria reeked, looking down at her ruined outfit. "You stupid girl!" Victoria yelled, her mask of mourning slipping to reveal the rage beneath. In the confusion, a heavy-set construction worker, Luca, in disguise, bumped into the distracted bodyguard holding the briefcase. The briefcase fell. Before it hit the ground, a hand in a dirty jacket snatched it. Edward. He moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He grabbed the case and melted instantly into the dense crowd of tourists. "My bag!" Victoria screamed, realizing too late what had happened. "Get him! Clear his throat, that man!" The bodyguards drew their weapons, but they couldn't shoot. The sidewalk was packed with civilians. Sophie was still on the ground, acting terrified. "Please don't hurt me." Victoria looked down at Sophie. For a split second, recognition flashed in her eyes. She remembered the clumsy waitress from the night before. "You," Victoria hissed. "Police," someone shouted. A patrol car siren wailed nearby. Victoria couldn't be seen assaulting a civilian. She glared at Sophie with a promise of death. "We're leaving," she snapped to her men. "Forget the girl. Find the bag." They pushed through the crowd, chasing the ghost of Edward Valente. Sophie scrambled up and ran in the opposite direction, ducking into the subway station as Edward had instructed. She leaped over the turnstile and vanished into the underground tunnels. She had done it. The adrenaline of the street heist faded the moment the heavy steel door of the warehouse rolled shut, leaving them in the dusty silence of the safe house. The air felt thin, charged with the electricity of what they had just done. They were no longer just hiding. They had struck back. Edward placed the stolen leather briefcase on the rusted metal desk. He stared at it for a long moment, his chest heaving slightly. This case contained the roadmap of his emperor and the proof of his wife's treachery. "Open it," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. She was nursing a bruised elbow where the bodyguard had thrown her to the pavement, a throbbing reminder that this game had physical consequences. Edward popped the brass latches. They clicked open with a sound like a pistol cocking. He lifted the lid. Inside lay the black ledger. It was an unassuming book bound in cracked leather, but it held the names of every judge, politician, and precinct captain on the Valente payroll. "We have the leverage," Edward said, his voice rough. He ran a hand over the cover almost reverently. "With this I can freeze Adrian out. I can cut off his protection." Clear his throat. He flipped the book open, scanning the pages. Sophie watched his face. She expected triumph. Instead, she saw his expression curdle into confusion, and then into a dark, terrifying realization. "What's wrong?" Sophie stepped closer, drawn into his orbit despite the danger. She updated it. Edward murmured, his finger tracing a line of fresh ink. "Look here." Sophie looked. "Judge McKinnon paid in full. Asset transfer complete." Edward flipped the pages faster, his eyes darting across the columns. The warehouses in Jersey. Sold. The shipping contracts liquidated. She's not just paying them off to keep them loyal. Sophie, she's cashing out. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. "She's liquidating the family assets," Edward said, turning to look at the wall of blank monitors. "She's selling the territory to the Russians. That's why she blamed the Brada for the hit on me. It wasn't just a cover for the murder. It was a prelude to a merger." "So, she's selling your empire," Sophie said softly. "She's selling my legacy," Edward corrected, his voice laced with a profound, aching bitterness. "Tonight, the final transaction happens tonight. The ledger confirms a meeting at the Masquerade Gala at the Pierre Hotel. The Russians love high society. It's the perfect cover." He looked at Sophie, his eyes burning with a renewed, desperate intensity. "We have to go, Edward." "We can't," Sophie argued, backing away. "You're a dead man, walking. Clear his throat. If you walk into the Pierre into a room full of mobsters and hired guns, they'll kill you before you make it past the code check." "Not if they don't know it's me," Edward said, pacing the small room. "And not if I have the one thing the Russians want more than territory." "What's that?" "The codes to the offshore accounts," Edward said, tapping his temple. Victoria can sell them the land, she can sell them the roots. But she can't give them the money. The liquid cash, hundreds of millions, is locked behind biometric encryption that only I have. I'm going to offer Nikolai Vulov a better deal. You're going to negotiate with the people who supposedly tried to kill you.
Business is business, Sophie.
Edward, said his voice, hardening into the tone of the dawn. Nikolai is a pragmatist. If I offer him the money, he'll turn on Victoria in a heartbeat. But I can't get close to him. Victoria's men will be everywhere. They know my walk, my build. I'd be spotted in seconds. He stopped pacing and turned to her. The silence shed heavy and expectant. I need you to be my voice. Sophie shook her head, her hands raising defensively. No. No way. Edward, look at me. I serve pasta. I drop forks when I'm nervous. I can't infiltrate a high society gala and negotiate with a Russian warlord. Edward closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He reached out his hands, gentle but firm, and cupped her shoulders. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, grounding her panic. Sophie, listen to me, he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. You acted the part of the clumsy girl perfectly today. You saved my life in the restaurant. You stole the ledger from under the noses of armed killers. You are not just a waitress. I've watched you handle the most arrogant, dangerous men in the city at Barolles. You have a quiet dignity they can't buy, and an invisibility they don't suspect. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a black credit card, one of the few emergency lines Victoria hadn't thought to cancel yet. Buy a dress, buy a mask. Meet me at the service entrance of the Pierre at 800 p.m. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a spectacle of excess. Under the glow of massive crystal chandeliers, a sea of velvet silk and Venetian masks swirled to the music of a live string quartet. The air smelled of expensive champagne, heavy perfume, and money. Sophie stood at the edge of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt like an imposter, a fraud who had sneaked into the palace, but she didn't look like one. Clear his throat. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered like deep water under the lights. It hugged her frame, transforming the shy waitress into a statue of elegance. A silver filigree mask covered the upper half of her face, hiding her terror. Invisible, she told herself. Just be invisible until you need to be seen. She scanned the room. She spotted them instantly. Victoria and Adrian were unmasked, standing near the center of the room like royalty holding court. Victoria looked radiant and triumphant, laughing at something Adrian whispered, toasting with vodka. They were celebrating their victory on her husband's grave. Sophie swallowed her bile and turned her gaze to the far corner near the ice sculpture. Nikolai Vulov, the head of the Russian Bratstva. He was a bear of a man, imposing even in a tuxedo, surrounded by a perimeter of hardied men who were clearly not there for the hors. Sophie took a deep breath. She touched the earpiece hidden beneath her hair. I see him, she whispered. Go. Edward's voice crackled in her ear, steady and reassuring. I'm in position on the roof. Just say the words. Sophie drifted through the crowd. She moved with a grace she didn't know she possessed. Fueled by sheer survival instinct, she approached the wall of Russian security. One of the guards stepped forward to block her, but she held her ground. Mr. Vulov, she said, projecting her voice just enough to cut through the music. The Russian boss turned. He looked down at her, his eyes cold and assessing behind a black domino mask. Do I know you, Kavita? I have a message from a ghost, Sophie said, keeping her voice steady, reciting the script Edward had burned into her memory. The accounts are empty. Victoria is selling you a hollow shell. Nikolai's polite smile vanished instantly. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Who sent you, Edward Valente? Sophie whispered. He is alive, and he is here. Nikolai's eyes darted around the room, scanning the masks, looking for the dead man. Impossible. He is ready to transfer the real offshore codes to you. Sophie pressed her hands, trembling slightly inside her clutch, in exchange for one thing. What Nikolai asked, his voice a low rumble. The heads of the traitors. Nikolai looked across the room at Victoria, who was happily accepting condolences from a senator. He looked back at Sophie. He was a businessman, and he knew when a deal smelled rotten. Clear as throat, Victoria had promised him assets, But without the cash codes, the Valente empire was crippled. "Bring him to me," Nikolai said quietly, making a split-second decision. "Room 412. 10 minutes. If this is a trap, you will not leave this hotel alive." Sophie nodded, her knees shaking. 10 minutes? She turned to leave, desperate to get away from the suffocating aura of violence radiating from the Russian. She needed air. She needed to tell Edward it was done. She moved quickly toward the exit, her head down. She was almost clear of the dance floor when the crowd shifted. A waiter dropped a tray, causing a ripple of movement. Sophie swerved to avoid the mess and collided hard with a solid chest. "Watch where you're going." A voice sneered. Sophie froze. The blood drained from her face. She knew that voice. She had heard it order a car bomb. It was Adrian. She kept her head down, mumbling an apology, trying to pull away. "Excuse me." Adrian grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. Wait. He wasn't letting go. He pulled her closer, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't looking at her mask. He was looking at her jawline, the only part of her face exposed. "I know that chin," Adrian whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the trembling waitress he had threatened. He remembered the girl who had vanished. The waitress. He breathed. He ripped the silver mask from her face. The elastic snapped. Sophie stood exposed in the middle of the ballroom, staring into the eyes of a monster. "It's her!" Adrian shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "It's the rat!" He reached into his tuxedo jacket. The music stopped. Screams began to rise from the guests. Sophie stumbled back, tripping on her gown. Adrian drew a sleek black pistol and leveled it at her chest. Bang! A gunshot rang out, but Sophie didn't feel the bullet. Adrian dropped his gun, clutching his shoulder as red bloomed across his white shirt. He fell back, screaming. High above on the mezzanine balcony, a figure stood silhouetted against the light. Edward Valente, holding a sniper rifle, lowered the weapon. He wasn't wearing a mask. Adrian Edwards' voice boomed over the panicked crowd, shaking the very walls of the hotel. "You're sitting in my chair." Sophie turned away from Nikolai Vulov, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had delivered the message. The seed of doubt had been planted in the Russian mobster's mind, but the danger was far from over. Every second she remained on the open floor of the Pierre Hotel ballroom was a gamble with her life. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the underlying metallic tang of tension. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the carpet, trying to weave through the throng of masked guests toward the service exit. "Invisible," she chanted silently. "Just be invisible for 30 more seconds." But fate, cruel and sharp, intervened. As she rounded a pillar, a heavy solid mass stepped directly into her path. She collided with a hard chest, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. She stumbled back, murmuring a breathless apology, desperate to keep moving. "Watch where you're going," a voice sneered. The sound of that voice froze the blood in her veins. It was a voice she had heard through a ventilation grate plotting murder. It was Adrian. Sophie didn't look up. She couldn't. She tried to sidestep him, to blend back into the stream of dancers, but a hand shot out, clamping around her wrist like a manacle. His grip was bruising, possessive, and terrifyingly strong. "Wait," Adrian said, his tone shifting from annoyance to suspicion. He pulled her closer, ignoring her flinch. Under the crystal chandeliers, the ballroom was bright, unforgiving. Adrian Clear's throat leaned in, his eyes narrowing behind his own mask as he studied the lower half of her face. He studied the curve of her jaw, the specific terrified tremble of her lip. He had seen that face in the dim light of the restaurant just 24 hours ago. "I know that chin," Adrian whispered, the realization dawning on him like a physical blow. "The waitress." Sophie gasped, trying to wrench her arm free, but it was too late. With a violent jerk, Adrian ripped the silver mask from her face. The elastic snapped. The mask clattered to the floor. Sophie stood exposed, her eyes wide with terror, staring into the face of the man who wanted her dead. "It's her," Adrian shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "She's the rat." The music from the string quartet faltered and died. Heads turned. The polite murmur of the gala was severed by the raw violence of the moment. Adrian reached into his tuxedo jacket. the movement fluid and practiced, and withdrew a sleek black pistol. He raised the weapon, leveling it directly at Sophie's chest. "No!" Sophie screamed, throwing her hands up a futile shield against a bullet. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that shattered the elegant atmosphere. But Sophie didn't fall. She didn't feel the searing heat of a bullet. Instead, Adrian jerked violently backward. A spray of red mist erupted from his shoulder, staining his white dress shirt. He dropped his gun, clutching his wound with a howl of agony that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Up there, someone screamed. Sophie looked up, following the gaze of the terrified crowd. High above the ballroom, standing on the gilded railing of the mezzanine balcony, stood Edward Valente. He was silhouetted against the light, a dark, avenging angel in a tuxedo. In his hands he held a sniper rifle, the barrel smoking. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need one. Clear his throat, he wanted them to see his face. He wanted them to know that the ghost had come to collect. Adrian Edwards' voice boomed over the panicked crowd, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence. "You're sitting in my chair!" Pandemonium erupted. It was total absolute chaos. Hundreds of guests screamed in unison, a tidal wave of panic. People scrambled for the exits, overturning tables, shattering crystal glasses, trampling over the fallen hors d'oeuvres. The elegant gala dissolved, into a stampede. Edward didn't hesitate. He dropped the rifle and grabbed a thick velvet curtain that draped from the ceiling to the floor. Wrapping it around his arm, he leaped from the balcony. He slid down the fabric, controlling his descent with sheer strength, landing on a banquet table with a heavy crash that sent plates flying. He rolled off the table and came up in a crouch, drawing 2 handguns from holsters beneath his jacket. "Sophie, get down!" Edward roared, his eyes scanning the room for threats. Sophie didn't need to be told twice. She dove behind the heavy mahogany bar, curling into a ball as the air above her turned into a kill zone. Bullets began to fly. Adrian's personal security detail had recovered from the shock and were engaging. Glass exploded above Sophie's head as rounds radded the liquor shelves. Shards of mirror and bottles rained down on her, smelling of expensive scotch and fear. She covered her ears, sobbing the noise, a deafening cacophony of gunfire and screams. But Edward was a force of nature. He moved through the ballroom, not with the chaotic energy of a brawler, but with the precise lethal grace of a predator reclaiming his territory. He utilized the confusion, moving from cover to cover, a pillar, an overturned table, an ice sculpture. He fired with calculated precision. 2 of Adrian's guards dropped neutralized before they could draw a bead on him. Clear his throat, Sophie peeked over the edge of the bar. She saw Edward advancing, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He wasn't shooting to kill the fleeing guests. He was cutting a path straight to his wife. Victoria was no longer the composed, grieving widow. Shh! He was crouching behind the massive swan ice sculpture, her face a rich of terror and fury. She watched her empire crumbling, watched her husband rise from the dead to take it all back. Beside her, Adrian was struggling to his feet, blood soaking his jacket. "We have to go," he screamed at her, his voice wet with pain. "He's alive. The ghost is real." But Victoria wasn't running. Her eyes were locked on Edward's back as he engaged the last of the bodyguards. She reached into her clutch purse. Her hand came out trembling, holding a small pearl-handled pistol. Edward didn't see her. He was focused on the threat in front of him. Clear his throat, he was exposed. Victoria raised the gun, aiming it squarely between her husband's shoulder blades. She steadied her hand with her other palm. She was going to finish what the bomb had failed to do. Sophie saw it. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an agonizing crawl. She saw the glint of the metal in Victoria's hand. She saw Edward's back. She knew she couldn't scream loud enough to be heard over Clear's throat, the gunfire. She had to act. Sophie scrambled up from behind the bar. Her hand closed around the neck of a heavy Magnum bottle of champagne sitting in a bucket of melting ice. It was cold, heavy, and solid. With a guttural cry that ripped from her throat, Sophie heaved the bottle. It spiraled through the air, end over end, a dark green missile. Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger. Crack. The heavy bottle smashed into Victoria's outstretched hand and wrist with bone-shattering force. The pistol went flying, skittering across the marble floor. Victoria shrieked, clutching her broken hand to her chest, doubling over in pain. Edward whipped around at the sound of the impact. He saw the shattered bottle on the floor. He saw his wife broken and Clear's throat disarmed. And then he looked past her to the bar. He saw Sophie standing there, chest heaving her hair, wild terror and adrenaline roaring in her eyes. Edward turned back to his wife. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, the glass crunching beneath his dress shoes. Adrian, desperate and foolish, tried to intervene. He lunged at Edward with a hidden knife, a last-ditch effort from a dying animal. Edward didn't even break stride. He sidestepped the clumsy thrust, caught Adrian's wrist, and with a sickening crunch twisted the knife back against the joint. Adrian fell to his knees, groaning, utterly defeated. Edward stopped in front of Victoria. The ballroom was eerily silent now, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens and the sobbing of his wife. "You wanted to be a widow," Edward said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silence it carried more weight than the gunfire had. It was cold, devoid of the love he had once held for her. "You wanted the money, you wanted the power. You had everything, Victoria. You had me." Victoria looked up at him. Her mascara was running in black streaks down her face. Her eyes were filled not with regret, but with a venomous, tragic hate. "I hated you." She spat the words tearing out of her. "You were always so cold, so distant. You treated the business like a god and me like an accessory. I wanted to feel something. Dom, I wanted to burn it all down just to see if you would flinch." "You'll feel a cell," Edward said simply, "and you'll have a long time to think about whether it was worth H." He turned his gaze to the center of the room. Nikolai Vulov was still there. The Russian boss stood surrounded by his own men who had formed a defensive ring. They hadn't fired a shot. They had watched the internal purge with calculating eyes. "The police are 2 minutes away," Nikolai Edward called out, his voice steady. He tapped the lapel of his jacket. "I have a wire." Victoria and Adrian confessed to the bombing. They confessed to the conspiracy. This is an internal family matter that has been resolved. Nikolai looked at the broken Adrian, the sobbing Victoria, and the formidable Edward Valente. He nodded slowly. He respected strength, and he respected the code. "The territory is yours." "Don Valente," Nikolai said, his voice growly. "We will renegotiate the terms tomorrow when the dust settles." The Russians holstered their weapons and vanished out the back exits, slipping away like sock before the law arrived. Edward was finally alone, the wreckage of his life. He holstered his guns. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the last 24 hours began to drain away, leaving a heavy exhaustion in his bones. He walked over to the bar. Sophie was still standing there trembling. He reached out his hand, hovering for a moment, before he gently touched her hair. He pulled a small shard of green glass from a lock of her blonde hair, shrapnel from the bottle she had thrown. "You threw a bottle of champagne," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. Sophie let out a shaky, hysterical laugh. "It was a 96 Dom Perignon. Marco would kill me for wasting it. It was on the reserve list." "Marco works for me," Edward said softly. "And so do you, if you want." The sound of heavy boots thundered in the hallway. "Police, drop your weapons, hands in the air." The SWAT team burst through the double doors. Rifles raised, tactical lights cutting through the gloom. Edward slowly raised his hands above his head. He didn't look at the police. He kept his eyes locked on Sophie, anchor in the storm he had created. "It's over, Sophie," he promised her, his voice a quiet vow amidst the shouting of the police. "It's finally over." And for the first time since she had slipped that note under a glass of scotch, Sophie believed him. What a roller coaster. From a trembling hand slipping a note to taking down a crime syndicate with a bottle of champagne, Sophie's journey proves that even the quietest voices can scream the loudest when it matters. It's a reminder that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing. Anyway, if you enjoyed this twisty mafia romance saga, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. What would you have done in Sophie's shoes? Would you have slipped a note or run out the back door? Let me know in the comments below.